Hello, I'm Santa Clara County Supervisor Ken Yeager. In the early 1980s, the local LGBTQ community was at a low point. A pair of gay civil rights measures had been overwhelmingly rejected by local voters, and the beginning of the AIDS epidemic was making the general public fearful of gay men. In this atmosphere, some of us knew that something had to be done politically for the community. We formed a political action committee, the Bay Area Municipal Elections Committee, or BAYMEC, to support our friends and fight our enemies. 33 years later, BAYMEC is still carrying the flag for LGBTQ rights in Silicon Valley. Today, 3 of the founders of BAYMEC have joined me to reflect on those days and talk about the struggles that still lie ahead. Our discussion will be moderated by Valley Politics host Terry Christensen. Here's Terry.
Thank you, Ken. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, founders of BAYMEC. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself briefly by telling us what you were doing in 1984 when BAYMEC was founded and what you're doing now. Start with Wiggsy Sivertsen.
Well, in 1984, I was working at San Jose State University, where I had been for some time, and I was working with the students on some issues of GLBT stuff, and then we just had gotten through trying to deal with the A and B election, which was anti-gay, lesbian legislation that some of the people in the community thought was necessary.
And we'll come back to that. Ken Yeager.
I was working for a local congressman, Congressman Don Edwards.
A local hero,
a local hero. I'd been involved in politics and campaigns. I was out to some people, but not to everybody. It was a very anti-gay climate, and certainly even being a gay staffer was something that elected officials really didn't want.
Rich Gorden.
So in 1984, I was the executive director of a nonprofit providing services to at-risk teenagers. I'd come out of the closet in 1982, so only 2 years as an out and open person.
Yeah, and this was in San Mateo County.
San Mateo County.
Yeah. John Laird.
In late, excuse me, in late 1983, I had been elected mayor of Santa Cruz, and in that year and at that time, there were the first 3 openly gay mayors in the United States, and Santa Cruz was one, and I was serving my first term in 1984.
And today?
Today I'm Secretary for Natural Resources in the Governor's Cabinet, which markedly different. I have 25 departments, 19,000 people, a $10 billion budget, and if you hear about a dam overflowing or fires going on,
John
or
Laird.
floods, yes, I'm
Yeah.
Somewhere near that.
Actually, the others of you didn't follow directions very well and tell us what you're doing now. So let's go around again with Wiggsy.
Well, I'm actually retired from the university, have been for a couple of years. I do a very small private practice seeing clients, and I'm working with the Senior Commission for the County of Santa Clara, and then just other kinds of stuff. I'm still with BAYMEC, and I do, whatever needs to be done.
Okay, Ken?
In 1992, I ran for Community College Board in Santa Clara County and won that election and became the first openly gay person in the entire county. In 2000, I ran for San Jose City Council and won. In 2006, ran for Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors.
Okay,
Yeah.
and you're still serving as a
And I'm
supervisor.
still serving as a
of course.
supervisor.
Rich?
Well, I ended up spending almost 20 years in elected office, 13 years in the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors, and 6 years in the California State Assembly. Currently, I'm the president and CEO of the California Forestry Association, representing timber companies.
Yeah, we thought you'd be in a lumberjack shirt today. this is what you're wearing now. Well,
I traded off the plaid for this.
Very nice, thank you. So I want to, before we actually get into the founding of BAYMEC, I'd like you all to talk a little bit about what was going on before the founding, because the 60s, 70s, early 80s were very tumultuous years for the LGBT community. In fact, it wasn't even really a community during some of that period. So what are some of the events leading up to the founding of BAYMEC that you thought were important? John?
Well, there were so many different things. And coming from Santa Cruz, there was all this local organizing, and we recently had a 40th anniversary of Gay Pride and the Trailblazers, and it was There was a newspaper for lesbians. There was a men's group that 90 of us were in regularly. We had an animated gay pride every year. We were organizing in schools. We had a gay magazine, and we were doing things. We remembered this one really funny organizing thing when we were celebrating about the fact that a local nightclub did an ad that had stick figures of a man and a woman, and then stick figures of two men together with a circle and a line through it, and two women with a circle and a line through it. And a bunch of us gathered at a house and paired off lesbians and gay men and went as apparently straight couples, and then took over the dance floor at a key moment at that time. And those were some of the things that we were having to do in that era.
So Santa Cruz has been celebrating Gay Pride for 40 years?
We just had this last summer, I think, our 43rd.
43rd.
Yeah.
Rich, what do you remember from that time?
Well, San Mateo County was a very different place. There was no organized groups. There were a handful of bars, and folks, gathered in the bars on Friday and Saturday night, and then went back to their little suburban homes. There really wasn't much organizing, and there was very little sense of community.
Ken?
Well, we had gone through the Measure A and B campaign in 1980, and that sort of allowed the gay community to sort of organize in support of these two measures that would have barred discrimination at the local level because there was no state or federal level.
City of San Jose and Santa Clara County.
That's right.
Ordinances.
That's right. They had been passed by those two, by the City Council and the Board of Supervisors, and then the religious right, which was just picking up steam throughout the country, organized and then got signatures to put a referendum on the ballot. And that then was voted on the people, and basically 75% of the voters were opposed to those gay rights ordinances. And that really just sort of put a blanket on any gay movement that was happening locally, because the signal was that the community didn't support gay rights. And so that was very much what I was in. At the same time, the legislature had passed AB 1, which was the first time that would prohibit discrimination at the state level. And it was at the governor's desk to sign, Governor Duke Majan, and our local assembly member had written an op-ed in the paper saying that gay people were so despicable they didn't deserve any rights at all. And so it was a time you could sort of make those public statements really so anti-gay that you would just assume that the people were going to be with you.
Wiggsy, I know you were involved with the campaign against the Briggs Initiative. John Briggs, was that Proposition 6? 1980.
Late 70s.
78. It was 78.
Yeah, 78.
Yeah. Tell us about that.
Well, it was a totally kind of diabolical proposition that Senator Briggs decided California needed to keep gay and lesbian people out of schools, and even people who were friendly with gay and lesbians, they shouldn't be there either. And so the fight was to create legislation on his part, to create legislation that would take gay people out of the classroom. It was a pretty intense battle, and I think that it was really kind of the linchpin that the gay community began to kind of think about being organized, particularly in the big areas like San Francisco, the Bay Area, LA. And I think even some of the people outside in the more rural kind of areas began to think about, well, gee, maybe there is something here. We did defeat that legislation. I think to a great extent it was with the help of Richard Nixon, not Richard Nixon,
Ronald
the other,
Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, and Jimmy Carter. I mean, they both stated that
Governor and President then, yeah.
Yeah, they both stated that the legislation wasn't necessary, and I think people in California got that.
And if I can just add a very funny anecdote, then years later, fast forward, I'm in the state legislature, and they bring John Briggs to the back of the floor. And I walked back and I just said, you know, you really helped get me politically involved. And he just beamed. He had no idea what I had just told him.
That's a great story. That election was November 78.
Right.
Shortly after that, Harvey Milk, first elected gay supervisor in San Francisco, and George Moscone, very gay-friendly mayor of San Francisco, were assassinated.
Right. Right.
So that certainly had an impact on the mood.
Yeah, it really had a huge impact from my standpoint of looking at it. You know, that finally I think the gay community recognized that this was going to be a tough ride for us, but we had to get on the horse and ride it. We couldn't just sit back and not do anything. The killing of those two gentlemen was horrendous. And young folks, you know, like college students, even younger than that, were profoundly impacted by that.
And you know, you asked earlier to sort of set the tone of that period, and right in that vein, it took me ages to go see the movie Milk, and I think it's because I had heard him speak a few times, but I knew everybody around him close, but I sort of knew how it ended, and I didn't think I'm gonna want to put myself through this. And when I finally saw it, you view that era through the prism of everything that's happened since, and you forget just how powerless we were. The fact that he was having to organize to run over to clubs when police were busting heads for just people going out to a bar. It's phenomenal. We view him as an icon, but that's what he was having to do at the time. That's what was sort of happening at the time of Measure A and B, and that's where BAYMEC first came from, is to start from that scratch and try to deal with it.
Yeah, and nationally, Anita Bryant had their Save the Children campaign. They repealed an ordinance in Miami-Dade. Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, John Briggs and Proposition 6, later Lyndon LaRouche and some other propositions. This is after the founding of BAYMEC, though, I think.
Right.
Yes.
So now we get to the founding of BAYMEC. Ken, I think it was your idea.
It was.
And where did it come from?
Well, I had always been very political, so I sort of knew how to organize, who to contact. This was a world that I knew. And when I had read that op-ed by a local assembly member, I realized that if I didn't fight for my own rights, nobody else would. And so then a week later, I wrote a response to that and then sort of came out to everybody. And that then gave me the freedom to get involved in gay politics. And it was really through you that Wiggsy and I got together. I certainly knew who she was, but hadn't really worked with her a lot. And I was friends of a man in Los Angeles named David Mixner, who became well known mainly because of his early support for Bill Clinton. And he had organized a group called MECLA, which sounds very much like BAYMEC, the Municipal Elections Committee of Los Angeles. And they would have big fundraisers and raise money and really be very public about their support. And I figured, well, if they could do that in LA, maybe we could do something like that up here. And so I flew down to Los Angeles and met with them, and that's sort of where the idea came from. And then Wiggsy and I were just trying to figure out, well, how do we create this organization that's going to be successful? We knew we had to be very professional because other organizations had failed, and here we were going to ask for money and support, and we didn't then want to like disappear or disintegrate 6 months later. And so we were very, very thoughtful in all the steps that we took and trying to get the right board members as well.
Wiggsy?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we did that was a little different than what was going on is we were a little bit less strident about people who were not stepping right out to be our supporters. You know, that they were kind of reluctant and stepping to the back. I often think of the times that you and I went to see Norm Mineta, you know, a couple of times to see if we could encourage him to come over and be our support.
Norm Mineta was mayor of San Jose,
Yeah.
and then he was a member of Congress by this time.
And he did finally come over, and when he came, he was certainly wonderful about being our supporter. But it was a time when people were going, who are these weird people that want us to support them, you know, that we can't do that. And people were courageous. I mean, and some people were really cowardly and awful, but I've always been appreciative of the people who were really quite courageous and stepped forward, even at the expense of themselves, because one of the things that Ken and I talked a lot about is that we didn't want to kind of be a fly in your face kind of organization. You know, if you didn't do what we wanted you to do, then we would, you know, jump all over you. We wanted to kind of invite people to come along, and we wanted to be more involved in the community, not only with our own issues, but issues of discrimination against other people in the community, so that we were all recognizing we're kind of all pulling the same wagon. We just need to get together and do it.
You know, we didn't mention the years leading up to this that we were discovering AIDS at about that time in the early 1980s. So this was an extra motivation to get political, right? To begin to address that problem and the discrimination that was arising because of it. So right away you reached out to the other counties, John in Santa Cruz and Rich in San Mateo. Why did you think it needed to be regional? Most PACs are much more locally focused.
Yeah, and that really came from David Mixner. There were several other similar PACs, and again, you could certainly have a political club that wasn't a PAC, political action committee, that you have to register with the state and or the federal government if you were involved in federal campaigns. And so it was a definite type of gay organization. And there was one in San Diego, there was one in Orange County, and one in Los Angeles, and one starting in San Francisco. And Mixner's idea was that there would be these political action committees all throughout the state. And so by including San Mateo and Santa Cruz, it enabled us to sort of have the Bay Area so we would be active in all three counties. That's really where the idea came from.
Rich, were you hard to recruit?
No.
Never have been.
I've never had been. It's always been easy. It was something, I've been political, been involved in campaigns, and had thought at one point about running for office. Early in my life, and then when I came out, I said, "Well, that will never happen. Not going to do that, but maybe I can help others." When I was approached, it was actually through a friend, a guy named Doug DeYoung, who I think Ken had first reached out to.
Right.
Doug didn't know me. He was a patient of my husband's medical practice, and my husband said to him one day, Rich is really interested in politics. You should talk to him. So I went up and met with Doug DeYoung, and he said, there's this brand new group. He said, I don't drive very well. You drive me down to San Jose. So I was his driver for the first meeting, and decided this was something I really wanted to be engaged in.
John, Santa Cruz was a little bit ahead of the curve. You were already a mayor, the mayor, you were already out. Why did you sign up right away?
Well, I think it was stronger regionally, and you really could bring a lot more to bear. And just as Wiggsy was talking about Norm Mineta, at the time my congressman was Leon Panetta, and so I made this point of going and sitting down with him at the beginning of every session. And at that time, I think Paul Tsongas was still in the House. He hadn't moved to the Senate, and he was trying to do the civil rights bill. And the key thing was, could you get more sponsors every session than you had in the previous session? And I think there was one time when he crossed 50, and we thought we had arrived. And so I would go and sit down with Leon Panetta and say, we want you to be a co-sponsor. And I remember he would say things like, I really don't want to sponsor a bill unless it's going to move. And then I would say, yes, but it's not going to move until it has critical mass because it keeps having sponsors. And out of me and us asking, he would go on every year and really be helpful. And I had to smile when, after him being at that point, then years later that investment turns around that he's presiding over the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell as defense secretary. And so it's sort of a tribute to when you're doing all these things that over time they get you somewhere.
Yeah, true.
Rich mentioned Doug DeYoung. Are there others who are founders of BAYMEC that we should also recognize here for a moment? High-tech gays, I think.
Rick Rudy.
Rick Rudy.
Very key. And also Ron Taylor. And Ron was sort of the connection to high-tech gays. He often would have the meetings at his house, and I remember going to it right when we were thinking about starting BAYMEC, and there would be 50, 75 young tech workers there. And it was the first time I had sort of seen that number of people sort of involved in a community organization. And I told myself, well, if they will come to this, maybe they'll get involved in BAYMEC. And certainly just because they were able to have so many members, and they would have Sunday potlucks at the DeFrank Center, that it was somewhere that BAYMEC could go and hand out literature and do talks and sort of get people involved. And Ron Taylor's still around. He was very involved in ERIS, which was an AIDS support group, and so there was that connection. The first person from Santa Cruz was Wanda House, and I don't know how much of a name that you remember.
Oh, I remember her.
And I think she might have
absolutely.
been one of the connections to you. She now lives, I think, in a southern state, and so we haven't been able to get back in contact with her.
Yes, but it was very similar to Rich's situation. She sort of said, they're doing this. We need to have somebody there. You're a logical person. Would you get involved in this?
Right.
You know.
The other person was Nikki Nichols,
Oh, yeah.
who, along with her partner Johnny Staggs, ran our paper, Your Paper. And I should say, Wiggsy and I very much wanted it to be gay men and lesbians. It was just, by default, you could have gotten gay men, but that wasn't what we were trying to do. And so we were always trying to get as many women involved as we could.
Yeah, and we didn't do one thing that a lot of the organizations did, and that was you had to have one gay man, one lesbian, 2 gay men, 2 lesbians. We just kind of threw everybody in the same basket, just because we needed them there. Dot James, I was thinking about her the other day. She was there for a little while, but you know, we didn't get into that conflict that some organizations got into about men and women issues.
Right.
And I think one of the things that really helped a whole lot in a very tragic sort of way was the AIDS crisis. Because what the AIDS crisis did is it really, I think, brought women into the gay community. There had been together at one time way back, and then they separated again, and women were over here and men were over here, and the AIDS crisis brought people back because women knew how to take care of people. That's what we're trained to do as women. And so we all worked together on that. It was a much more eclectic, involved, cooperative group of relationships that I thought really helped out a lot in terms of viewing the gay community.
Let's talk a little bit about what you all saw as the goals of BAYMEC at the outset. Wiggsy mentioned allies on human rights issues with other communities on civil rights. What else? What did you think you were trying to do?
Well, it was an extension of what Ken and Wiggsy were talking about already, which is sit down with elected officials and sit down with candidates, not just endorsements. I remember one time, and I think Ken had arranged it all, Don Edwards was in Congress, and he arranged something like a 7 a.m. breakfast, which for somebody that was coming to Santa Cruz was not a great personal thrill. But at 7 o'clock, I was there with everyone, and BAYMEC had breakfast with Don Edwards, so that he saw this large group of politically connected people that would be active in campaigns, people he knew, people that were from out his district. And I think there was a real goal of finding people over time where that was a constantly widening circle of people that you could do that with. That's just one of the first ones that I really remember.
It is almost hard to believe that this, for many of these elected officials, it was the first time they ever met with a group of gay people. You know, as astonishing as that is, and how nervous they were. And normally we had some connection with them that were able to try to set it up. But politically, it could have been risky for them. And of course, the idea too was to educate them about us and say that we can support you if you'll support us. But there was always, I'm sure, that thought in the back of my mind: is this really going to come back and haunt me? And so it was just sort of meeting with them and working with them. As we were talking about just for a second ago with AB1, which was the state legislation, a lot of our local leaders had voted against it. And so we really had to work with them up until then 1992, when actually the governor signed it. And at that point, all of our legislators were on board. But none of this was easy.
So sorry,
Terry,
Rich, go.
I always saw this initially as what we're doing was building a bridge to the elected officials who had made decisions that impacted our lives. And I also thought that eventually openly gay and lesbian people would also cross that bridge in greater numbers.
It seems like you were sort of establishing a group to play the inside game in politics, because ACT UP and others were out on the streets.
That is true, and they came down a little bit later than after we started.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I think that was a little bit unique about BAYMEC as a political action groups. We did a lot of other things that weren't necessarily directly political. Like we taught the San Jose Police Department about gay, lesbian rights. If other things were going on in other areas, we would have approached
We were very involved
those
in
things.
AIDS issues
Yeah, we
and
got
county
very
funding.
involved in the AIDS thing, the whole jail situation, where people were being really mistreated, and so we really stepped outside the boundaries of a pure political action in the sense that most people might think about it, and kind of involved the community. So the community came along with us.
And I think you hit it on the head in one way. One of the tensions has always been, this was really true with HIV, is how you do play the outside and the inside and play them off each other. I remember being really, as somebody that was an AIDS service agency director, which I did, I ran an agency after I left the city council, at times thinking, really, ACT UP is going to sit on the Golden Gate Bridge, and then everybody'd be paying attention for a while, and suddenly what we had done as an agenda based on what we were actually doing and what might be considered an inside game, people would start to pay attention to. And you always had to accept the inside and outside. And the thing that I always loved is, of course, is when it could be done with humor. So I remember they cited somebody at the Capitola Mall for a public display of affection between two gay people. So we had a kiss in, and then they said you couldn't pass out leaflets without public approval. So we leafleted the Constitution and made them cite people for leafleting the Constitution, and sort of did things that were just in essence fun, but just clearly making the points. And the whole time you had all the work BAYMEC was doing with the elected officials and legislation and training of public employees or whatever, in a way that it all worked off against each other.
Let's talk a little bit about some of those policy initiatives. Wiggsy, you were really involved with training San Jose Police on the lifestyle of the LGBT community. What was that like? Did they just love it?
Oh man, they sure loved it.
They went back for more.
Yeah, I remember when I first went in, they were not pleased about this because this was ordered by the city council, and police don't like that to happen. But the first time I went in, I heard this thing coming down the hall, tick, 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 and I thought, oh, that's an interesting noise. And they run this wagon into the room, the classroom. I'm standing, you have to stand behind a podium, it's very formal. And there are all these guns sitting on these pegs that had been downstairs to be cleaned and checked, because this is their training thing. And they couldn't wait to get their guns. They got up, went and got their guns, and were putting the bullets in them with the pistol pointed in my direction. And I let them do it for a while, and then I said, one of the things about having a therapist teach a class where all behavior is interpreted, and then I just went on. But it was interesting. I did it every week for God knows a year, I guess. And some of it was wonderful. I mean, some of the fellows it was mostly all men. Were very. I mean, one guy came up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder from behind, and whispered, "Thank you very much for doing this. It was really important." And I realized they're really scared to come out. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was just really and they're still, really struggling. Especially the men in the department, although the chief is extremely supportive, it's still, you still feel that strain of being identified and being able to be free about who you are.
The department now is actively recruiting gay and lesbian
amazing.
candidates.
Yes.
That's
Amazing.
a big change.
Yes.
Big change.
And the police department had a car in the gay pride parade that had a big gay pride flag on it.
And the police chief
And
was
the
there?
chief was there.
And he was there.
Yeah.
sitting in it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you see, I always love to tell the story. In one of the first Santa Cruz Gay Prides, those first years, we had to hire off-duty deputies to guarantee safety. Mm-hmm. And it was always difficult because there were more demonstrators than there were people marching. And then there was a time when I was in the legislature that we're lining up, and the sheriff and his top deputies are going to go, and they've been assigned the space right behind the medical marijuana float. And there's this big joint, and it's just puffing in the air. And they walked back to me and they said, would you mind if we marched around your car? And I thought, there you have it. There's the continuum from having to protect us to now somehow we're the safe port in the political storm.
Yeah.
That's good.
Ken, you mentioned BAYMEC's work on the AIDS crisis here in Santa Clara County. BAYMEC was instrumental in getting the first county AIDS task force going, right? I think you chaired it.
I did chair it, yeah.
So how did that happen? What did you have to do?
Well, I had the good fortune to have worked for several county supervisors, both of whom were on the board when we went before them, asking for funds.
Rod Dearden and Susie
Wilson, yeah, and a very supportive board. Dan McCorkadale, Diane McKenna, and
Jerry Steinberg? No, not that.
But anyway, but I realized that the county really had not been involved. And I think the other thing we knew about BAYMEC is if you didn't ask, you weren't going to get it. And nobody had been asking for all of these years. And so it wasn't that there was resistance, but certainly as I've realized as an elected official, I'm sure John and Rich are the same way, that if you don't do it, it isn't going to get done. And so we understood that we needed support from the county dollars to pay for so many programs, particularly when it came to housing and with shelter and with food. We needed AIDS education, and we need people going out there. Again, a time when people were scared of, and maybe rightfully so, of AIDS and how it was going to get transmitted, and there was nobody out there in the community sort of telling people what to do or giving education to gay men on what not to do to get infected. It was a terrible time, and so we really spent a number of years getting all that set up. Marty Fensterscheib was involved with the public health department and was really just a champion of what we were trying to do. So I think we were able to sort of make a difference here in Santa Clara County.
Yeah, well, speaking of scared, there were 3 ballot measures in 1986 and 1988.
Yes, that was bad.
Linda LaRouche sponsored them. They would have quarantined HIV positive persons. They would have required registration and reporting, kind of like what Donald Trump is doing with some immigrant groups now. And they were defeated.
Right.
But how much did the campaigns against those ballot measures give impetus to BAYMEC and to organizing in the LGBT community?
Well, I mean, I think a great deal, candidly. I think the community, particularly the gay men with AIDS, felt clearly under attack.
Yeah.
A disease that we didn't know where it was coming from. We knew very little in the beginning. Wiggsy is absolutely correct. It brought the community together, men and women working together. But I think when we saw these ballot measures, it was clearly an indication that we had to fight even harder. And I think folks who had been in the closet, hadn't been involved in our political world, decided, I've got nothing to risk. My life is on the line. I could die.
It was scary.
Yeah.
And that's a big motivator.
Well, Wiggsy and I were able, particularly here in Santa Clara County, use it as an organizing tool. And so in that sense, it worked out well for us. A lot of people still didn't know who BAYMEC was, and like in any minority community, there's always some suspicion and maybe a little resentment, and well, who are you, and why isn't so-and-so doing it, and so you have to sort of work that through. And we had only been in existence in a couple years. We knew we wanted to run the campaign, and we were able to get enough community support to do that, rather than have all the money go up to San Francisco or Los Angeles, with none of it really being tracked from Santa Clara County, because we needed to show that there was support down here and wanted to run a full campaign.
Well, and I think one of the things that we did get into a little bit of a push with the San Francisco group is that we knew what people needed down here. By that time, we'd been around enough. We knew where people were. We knew how they were responding to things. And to have San Francisco run a campaign when they didn't know this particular valley and people in it was really sort of foolish. And so we kind of just decided we're going to take the reins of this wagon and run it ourselves. And I think it was a good decision on our part. I think it was helpful.
But it helped us build the database, have communication with people, establish ourselves as a major political player.
Also, winning helps.
Winning
Yes.
helps.
Winning is
helps.
a
Winning
real,
always
really
helps.
good thing.
Yeah.
And we
to
won,
keep
and,
people engaged.
and it was defeated at a much greater number here in
Huge.
Santa Clara County than it
Yeah.
was statewide. So I think our work really mattered.
And maybe it helped to have enemies like Anita Bryant and Lyndon LaRouche and Jerry Falwell.
Jerry Falwell.
Well, that's
Phyllis
easy to
Chaplin.
say in retrospect. That's all that's all I can say now.
Yeah.
I think the thing is that all of us in our way through BAYMEC were working on those campaigns, but there were all these other ancillary issues. Yes, there were services, but I remember somebody from our local aid service agency, right after it started, was fired from an unrelated job, being an accountant, because they were just afraid. And so I had to go author a non-discrimination ordinance that would protect people in those circumstances. And there was just such a fear that it wasn't just in the statewide races, it cut through everything, and we were having to figure out all these different ways to organize just to try to keep bad things from happening. It's hard to remember just how bad the climate was at the time that we had those victories.
Well, I think one of the things that was along that line that was just astonishing to me is how incredibly stupid people were. They wouldn't go to San Francisco to go out to dinner because gay men would be waiting on them and they would catch AIDS. I mean, that's how basic the fear was, and the lack of knowledge and understanding. So it was really pretty astonishing to me. I didn't realize people
I would
could
say
be
more ignorance than stupidity.
well,
'cause
maybe
they just-
maybe a little bit of both.
really, there wasn't a lot of information out there. You just didn't know.
Sure,
Yeah.
and the type of medical care and people not being able to
Yeah.
be served, and new diseases coming up, and people dying so quickly, and people getting tested, and it took forever to get the results. And it was a terrible time.
So meanwhile, BAYMEC is starting to endorse candidates, or trying to endorse candidates, if candidates will accept the endorsement. When was the first BAYMEC dinner?
The one in the
well,
basement of
yeah, it was actually after the '86
After the
Prop 64.
Yeah, after Prop 64.
And looking back on it now, I mean, I can't emphasize how everything had to be planned out because we didn't want anything to fail. And so just putting on a big dinner and hoping people were going to pay $100 and you're going to fill things up, we weren't ready for that yet. And so after Prop 64, with all the volunteers and the house parties and all of that, we sort of felt we wanted to do a thank you celebration. And so we did it at the cafeteria at Mitty High School. The spaghetti feed, I think, charged $5 or something. And I'd say a couple hundred people came out. And that told us that we could have a big dinner and be successful.
Well,
and so then it was the next year that we had our first dinner.
Yeah, and that saying is also was the only political person that came to that dinner was Councilwoman Iola Williams.
San Jose council member.
So now this is where John gets to say something.
There were some other people there, but
He was our other openly gay official.
but you know, I was gay, so
Yeah. Oh yeah.
there was somebody that was an ally that.
There you go.
did
Yeah,
it.
an ally.
Yeah.
She was the only one.
She's the only one?
Yeah.
Only
Yes,
one?
she was.
But going back to what we were saying about the endorsements, I'll never forget it. Here we sent out the questionnaire in '84. So I think we formed around March, April, and the first election would have been November, and sent out the questionnaire, and almost nobody sent it back.
So
And
the questionnaire is asking people their position
Yes.
on anti-discrimination.
Right.
policy,
It's sort of like we're a gay organization. We're here to help you. You know, but
They
almost
didn't want your help.
But
Yeah.
no. And so almost nobody did. But there were certainly people like Don Edwards and John Vasconcellos, and people like that we called and said, please just answer it so we can include somebody in our endorsement slate. Because what kind of political action group were we if we didn't have anybody to endorse?
People were scared of the endorsement
Right.
initially, right?
Well, in some cases, they asked us if it was all right for them not to list us on their endorsement
you
list.
can endorse me, but don't tell anybody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and,
Right,
and
or
we
Don
were
won't tell
okay with. I
anybody.
mean, that was one of the differences
Yeah.
between us and others, is we said,
Yeah.
okay, but trying to bring them along.
And I know.
And
I'm
so
sorry, Rich.
how times have changed. So the first dinner, 2 elected officials in the room. Now it takes 20 minutes or more at the annual gathering to get all of the elected officials introduced.
And people fight for the endorsements.
Yeah.
They just
Yeah.
fight for the endorsements.
Yeah. Took a while. 30 years.
Yeah.
34 years.
And I should also say that at that point we had sent a check to one of the people, and they sent it back saying, "I'm sorry, we can't accept this."
This is a candidate BAYMEC endorsed
Yeah.
and sent money, and they sent the check back.
Right.
And that was Rusty Arrayas
And it
running
was
for
Rusty
Assembly.
Arrayas,
Let's name
yes.
names.
Okay, it was Rusty Ray, yeah.
Why not?
Yeah, sort of saying because of the political atmosphere in Sacramento, which was also tied
Yeah.
to AB1 trying to get that passed, and locally because
Maybe
of
one was
AB
the statewide anti-discrimination ordinance.
Yeah, and because of that, he sent back the money.
When do you think the ground shifted where more people started actually, first of all, accepting the endorsement, filling out the questionnaire, accepting the endorsements? Did you notice it in San Mateo County?
And talk a little bit about Tom Nolan, too, because
Yeah.
that was a
Tom
big,
Nolan.
big thing.
Yeah, so our situation was a little bit different because Tom Nolan got elected to the Board of Supervisors in San Mateo County, and after he was elected, he came out. So we had an openly gay man sitting on the Board of Supervisors. So, for example, when we were dealing with the AIDS issue, we didn't have to necessarily go petition the board. We had a board member petitioning the board. So the AIDS task force was formed without any need to petition or organize. It happened. So it was a little bit different with Tom being there. He served only 4 years, then ran for Congress and lost, and moved on in his life to nonprofit service. But those 4 years were really an important period for us because of his presence at the table.
Let's talk about how BAYMEC actually affected your elections. John, you were already in office before BAYMEC was founded. Did
Yes,
it help
but
you as you advanced
There
to
were
higher office?
Yes, it did help when I advanced, because I think one of the things that was mind-boggling to me is that any time I ran in a larger district, I felt like I had to come out in these new areas. That no matter how I fought, I was running in Monterey County the first time, and an invitation came to Mr. and Mrs., and I thought, oh, really? I'm going to have to do this again?
That's great.
Because I thought it was clear, and yet it really was a statement. Just as we had wanted a regional organization, it would make a regional statement. And sometimes it would open doors that people just wouldn't have otherwise considered. So it was very helpful when that happened. And it's always, BAYMEC has traded, when you're in legislative races, with not insignificant contributions. So it is really helpful. And they're willing to let you use the mailing list or other things at times. That was just an incredibly useful tool when that happened.
So mailing lists, volunteers, some volunteers, money.
Money.
Rich, what about your campaigns? Supervisor and Assembly?
Yeah, the same thing. I mean,
Yeah.
Access to the mailing list, access to volunteers, access to dollars. And it wasn't just a BAYMEC contribution, it was the folks who had been engaged in BAYMEC who also helped.
Oh.
But Terry, I just want to talk about one other thing quickly in this regard in terms of how BAYMEC impacted me. And that was that I applied for a job and did not get it. And the person said, we're not hiring you because you're gay. This was before there was any protection for the LGBT community in job discrimination. I went to an attorney who said, you can't be discriminated against for political activity. And you're involved with that gay political thing down there in San Jose. Maybe we can use that. And it was the leverage to allow me to get a settlement in a job discrimination case. So even before running for elected office, BAYMEC had my back.
That's a good outcome. That's a good outcome. Ken, would you be where you are today without BAYMEC?
No. Again, when you think, I talk to a lot of people that are thinking about running for office, and if they don't have sort of an organization or enough people behind them, how do you get people to walk for you, or make phone calls, or contribute, or stuff envelopes? And with all of the work with BAYMEC, and I just met a lot of people who I got to know, and I liked them, and they seemed to have liked me. And so when we were all doing this work, I could ask them, and they would come and they would help out. And I've been fortunate that I've always raised the maximum amount of money that I can in my elections, and that just wouldn't happen if I didn't have that network of donors.
Wiggsy, what about you? You've never run for office. Why not? And it's not too late.
Oh, really? What a chance. Well, I don't have the kind of personality to put up with some of the stuff that I think political people have. I mean, I remember talking with Anna Eshu about a community meeting that she was having and how people were screaming at her. I mean, I'd have to tell them to shut up and sit down and go away. I'm not good that way. And I wasn't going to put a dress on for anybody. Not good that way either. So I just like being with people and doing things, and I'm not very organized. If it hadn't been for Ken, we would never have been successful. It just didn't,
I think all the rest of us would agree that it's also important that some people not run for office, but actually do a lot of the work that gets people elected and keeps people in office and gives them support, emotional and other support. So
well, I always did say that if I was ever in a political gang fight, I wanted Wiggsy standing right next to me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And if I could just sort of follow up a little bit on that, I think what made Wiggsy and I such a good team is that for whatever reasons I was always very good at the organizing. And somebody when you have a group, you have to do all the paperwork and the buying the this and the coordinating the room and all that stuff. But you also need a spokesperson who can go out and rally the crowd and go before boards and whatever. And so the two of us worked out very well, and hours and hours each day going over absolutely everything, making sure we did everything right.
Well, in some ways, I often have thought about us that we were kind of like teenagers. We'd finish doing something together of an evening and go home, and then we get on the phone and talk to each other for another hour or so into the evening. It was amazing.
Yeah.
So thanks to BAYMEC and other organizations, there's a substantial number of LGBTQ elected officials in the region and statewide. Do you think that number has peaked? Is it going to increase? Where do you think we are in terms of elected?
It is definitely not peaked. And I mean, you even look at Virginia election night when the chief homophobe was taken out by somebody that was trans. That was just an exciting moment. And one of the things that was happening right at the time BAYMEC was being formed is that about 15 of us formed. It had all these different names through the years, the International Network of Lesbian and Gay Elected Officials, and now it's under the auspices of the Victory Fund. But there were, I think, 15 or 18 of us in West Hollywood, right after West Hollywood incorporated. And every year it meets, and I know I went to about the first 10 or 15. I still go to random ones. And it's phenomenal. We were so excited when we topped 30, I think. And I went to one in Seattle when I was in the legislature where the governor came and was the keynote speaker. There were 500 people at the dinner. There were over 200 or 300 people that were elected or appointed in attendance. And they were starting to be judges and legislators and just in every walk of life. And I think that actually we were there all the way along. We just either weren't out or weren't running, and that it's only going to go up. And it's like we're still way out of whack with what the equality is of how many people are out there. But it's only going to keep going because I think increasingly people realize that it's just whether you're good for Willow Glen or whether you're going to deliver as a county supervisor on a mental health program or whether you're going to try to put out a fire or whatever it is, you want whoever you think are the best people there. And if they're open and they're clear as part of it, that just tells you something about their character and their integrity. And so I just think it's just going to keep growing.
Ken, of course, you wrote the book Trailblazers about sort of the first generation of the LGBTQ electeds. Do you see new generations coming forward in Santa Clara County?
I do. There's a couple LGBTQ candidates running this time around, but I don't think we're even close to peaking. There's still way too few. I'm not even sure how many are in San Mateo County at this point. So
probably less than a dozen.
Yeah, so.
No, there's definitely room for growth, and I think that you will continue to see more, partially because I think we'll be driven by circumstance, by the dynamics of the time, and I think also we are a community that I think understands that if we don't continue to do this activism, we can slide back.
Yeah, I think
Go.
I think one of the things that we suffer from our own success to some extent. People have gone back to their fireplaces and reading good books or watching TV or whatever. But every time something comes up in Washington, like expelling all of the trans people from the military and stuff like that, it's a reminder of how vulnerable we still are as a community and how much work we have to do to get beyond that kind of attack, because that's so hurtful and hateful. To me, that, as a therapist, that's oftentimes what I go to is to think about how profoundly painful this stuff is to people, older people, young people, whatnot, when they do this kind of stuff in places, or people, like that idiot in Arizona talks about us as, some kind of bizarre notion of human beings. It's really awful.
But in Wiggsy, I also think that increasingly we have a responsibility for others.
Absolutely.
And you look across the globe, you look at states in this country, we still don't have national protections and job discrimination. Our work is not yet done on LGBTQ issues.
No, absolutely, but I think that I think that people in Santa Clara Valley, just to speak about this area, is that we're kind of complacent, and we can't be. We have to know that, what's going on in Atlanta is not okay for what's going on in Tucson. We have to be there for those people.
Although one of the interesting things this year is when Doug Jones won the Alabama Senate election, when you're watching him walk to the stage, there were all these equal signs that people were raising in the audience, and I thought, wow, they're open in Alabama. And they're part of his victory where it was a small victory, and that's just a good sign.
I am worried about what the Supreme Court might do with the Colorado wedding cake issue. I mean, it could be 5-4 that it's okay to discriminate against gay people based on religious beliefs, and bingo, we're almost, we lose a lot of ground.
So I think you're all agreed that the work of BAYMEC is not done.
No, it is not done.
Well,
not done.
then what's your advice to the next generation of BAYMEC leaders? Wiggsy, I know you're still on the board, and others of you are, Emeritus board members. Congratulations. Title which means very little, but...
Former mayor's the best title you could ever have.
That's true. That is true.
Former mayor, rather than mayor.
Yes, exactly.
So
People
what's
pay attention with no responsibility.
So what's your advice?
I'd say that, if you're African American, you're feeling it right now in this country,
Yes.
where things are not ever completely won. And as a naive 14-year-old, when the Civil Rights Bill was signed, I thought, oh, thank God, that's done. And not realizing that every generation, every so often, you completely have to re-win the rights and re-educate people and renew the commitment to it. That is totally true with everything that is LGBTQ. And so that would be my message, is that even if some of those challenges haven't totally happened yet, but what Ken said about the Supreme Court and the cake decision and what was done about trans troops and other things show that it's out there. And so I wouldn't be eternally vigilant, and there is a reason to stay in it and stay active.
Wiggsy, what's your advice?
Yeah, I think that people need to stay in it and stay active also, and I think we need to be more responsible about recognizing that what goes on in the political world is as much our responsibility as it is our heterosexual neighbors, and we can't sit back and just no vote because we don't like the way somebody's hair looks. I think we have to get much more vigilant about that, because I think when I look at what's going on in this country and I look at it from probably a different perspective, the hatred, the intense hatred and the inability to recognize that maybe John has a different idea than I have, but I don't have to hate him for that. I have to work with him and figure out how do we solve this. That's not going on. What's going on in this country right now is these people against these people, whoever those people are. And I think that's very dangerous for vulnerable communities. I think it's dangerous for, certainly for GLBT people. I think it's also dangerous for people of color, you know, for certainly Muslims, people of different religions. The idea that of course, I can't imagine asking somebody to make a cake for me that didn't like me, you know, I go, really get serious. But the idea that, you know, your religious freedom is being attacked because you have to make a cake, you know, how do people get there? There's no thinking, you know, it's not logical.
Rich, your advice? We're almost out of time, so make it quick. And then you.
I would just simply say you have to be involved. There's no question. Our lives are at stake and continue to be at stake.
And you know what? And I'm sorry to take some of your time, Ken, but involvement can actually be fun. It's social. Yeah. And one of the things I think BAYMEC does, and especially the dinner, it's a big social event. So people get some reward out of that. Ken, your advice?
Well, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done. We did a health assessment of the LGBTQ community and found out that there's a lot of issues still out there: drug and alcohol, mental health issues, how people interact with the health and hospital system. Transgender kids have a particularly hard time. Suicide rates. I mean, on and on and on. And then it's about, well, how do you go about trying to change that? And we've been doing that at the county as much as we can with the Office of the LGBTQ Affairs. So just because there's no big battle happening in the street doesn't mean that a lot of LGBTQ people's lives really need a lot of attention and work, and they are not always getting the services from government that they need.
And with that, John Laird, Ken Yeager, Rich Gorden, Wiggsy Sivertsen, founders of BAYMEC, thank you very much. Thanks for all you've done. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.